1989. The Soviets have pulled out of Afghanistan, and the Afghan Mujahideen factions were overjoyed. A world superpower brought to its knees by religious fighters who at time only lived off bread and water against the Soviet army and their weaponry. A tale of Dawood versus Jalut, or David versus Goliath, which I know is an overused analogy, but it's pretty accurate to the situation. And just as the Afghan Mujahideen factions were happy, so were the Afghan Arabs. The Afghan Arabs now viewed themselves as one of the key fighting forces in the war. And of course, I can't deny the Afghan Arabs' contribution to the Afghan war effort, from gaining international support, organizing international donations, and doing logistical runs for the Afghan Mujahideen. But if we're speaking strictly on military combat roles and things of that sort, then the Afghan Arabs were just a drop in the ocean of Afghan Mujahideen. But even with me getting all technical and putting on my actually turban, I don't matter, as the Afghan Arabs viewed themselves as an important fighting force within the combat roles of Afghanistan. And the fighting they did would give them military training, combat experience, confidence in their combat abilities. It would help organize the Afghan Arabs and also give the Afghan Arabs organizations, and the formation of political ties with other international Islamist and jihadist factions. And during this time of the late period of the Soviet intervention in Afghanistan to the Soviet withdrawal from Afghanistan, Abdallah Azzam and the Mek group would take a back seat, while the more youthful and energized Afghan Arabs like the new Al-Qaeda group and Osama bin Laden would begin to pick up the pace. On top of that, Azzam just had other issues to deal with, like trying to unite the Afghan Mujahideen leadership, especially between Masjid and Hekmatyar, while back home in Palestine, the first Intifada had begun. No surprise here, but for the Palestinian Abdullah Azzam, the Intifada hit very close to home for him. The city of Peshawar was now becoming a hub for international jihadist and Islamist groups of different ideological viewpoints. And the rise of these international jihadist and Islamist groups especially picked up during the late Soviet portion of the war or following the Soviet withdrawal. By 1989, Mek and Al-Qaeda weren't the only foreign fighter group. You had more independent actors like the Saudi-born Ibn Khattab, the Indonesian Jamiah Islamiyah, you had a whole new set of Algerian Islamists showing up, and you also had a whole new set of Egyptian Salafi jihadists showing up. These new groups of fighters were energized by tales of the Battle of Jedji, the glory of jihad and the miracles of martyrdom. But as more and more of these international fighters began to move into Peshawar, ideological lines were now being drawn in the sand. Heads up for those that don't know, but Islamists are not united in their political or at times theological viewpoints. Some of you guys might have heard about the whole leftist infighting meme and joke, especially on Twitter. Well, the same can be applied to Islamists, just add a religious vibe to it, which to be honest isn't that far from certain leftist circles, but that's beyond the point. Now, as the number of Afghan Arabs increased, so did the ideological differences, but also a growing ideological conflict. Now let's jump into some of those ideological conflicts and how Abdullah Azzam got pulled into them. Now heads up, Salafis don't like being called Salafis, or if we're going to be honest, no religious movement likes to be called the religious movement. They'd rather call themselves just followers of the actual religion. But people use terminology and I need to do distinctions between people, so Salafi is a term I'm using. And on top of that, for another layered discussion, I'm going to be calling this part General Salafis, because almost every Salafi would agree on this ideological point. A widely accepted Salafi viewpoint is that Salafis tend to dislike Shia religious practices and viewpoints, the usage of talisman, Sufi practices, and theological viewpoints, as they view these things as a bid'ah or a innovation against the core essence of Islam. There are many Muslims around the world who practice things that Salafis would view as bid'ah, and Afghanistan is no different. Afghanistan has many Muslims, and with many Muslims comes many practices of Islam. As more Afghan Arabs who held a Salafi viewpoint went to Pakistan and Afghanistan, they would begin to notice these different religious practices from a Salafi viewpoint and talk and act against them. And this would lead to tensions between the Afghan Arabs and the Afghan Mujahideen. One huge place of contention was the usage of talisman. Now, Salafis tend to dislike talisman, thinking that only Allah could protect you or invoke special powers, and wearing a talisman is very ineffective, and some would even see this as shirk, or making partners to the one and only God within Islam, Allah, who should have no partners, which would then be seen as something that is blasphemous and sacrilegious, called shirk. And you have many cases of this one example causing conflicts. As seen by this quote I'm gonna pull up, one of the short-sighted Arab brothers noticed an amulet hanging on the neck of one of the Afghan mujahids, and he grabbed it with his hand thinking this was the best way to do dawah. But the mujahid grabbed his hand and said, "What do you want?" "This is shirk," he said. The Afghan mujahideen replied, "But my sheikh made this amulet for me." The Arab did not relent, but tried to take it away by force, saying, "This is shirk and you have to take it off." So the Afghan stepped back and said, "You are the polytheist," loaded the gun, and wanted to shoot the Arab, but fortunately some brothers intervened. And here's another example of an amulet or a necklace causing another conflict. The doctor who had sworn to save lives had been working in a hospital in Wardak when some Afghan mujahideen brought in one of their wounded at death's door seeking emergency treatment. The man wore a tawiz, an amulet with Quranic verses around his neck. And then I skipped through the quote a little bit. Dr. Ahmed, who was not a jurisprudent in any shape or form, stated categorically that he would not treat the patient unless the amulet came off. The Afghans were incensed at the request while one of their companions was at death's door. And here was this Wahhabi, as they saw him, concerned about amulets and talisman. I don't know exactly what followed after, but Dr. Ahmed had to flee the hospital. He also had cases of funerals becoming areas of debate and contentions, but I think you guys are getting the point. Of course, Abdallah Azzam noticed these practices but held a very pragmatic viewpoint of live and let live. Azzam's viewpoint was one of, we have bigger issues to deal with, like the Soviet army across the border. And Abdullah Azzam had no issue working with Afghans that did religious practices that were different from a Salafi or even just an Arab background. Let me also say, this isn't me saying that Abdullah Azzam agreed with all these practices, but he had that pragmatic viewpoint. I also don't want to paint the picture of like a stereotype of like the overbearing Salafi Afghan Arabs and then the Sufi spinning Afghan Mujahideen. No, people are of course nuanced and there's layers to many things. Not all Afghan Arabs held a Salafi viewpoint, and even for Salafi-minded Afghan Arabs, not all of them were getting into theological debates. A lot of them held live and let live viewpoints too. You also had Afghans that prescribed to a Salafi viewpoint. And you also had cases of Afghan Arabs participating in Afghan religious practices as a way of easing tension and preventing any conflict. The tensions became such an issue that Abdullah Azzam would even have to start addressing it. Abdullah Azzam was now rebuking Afghan Arabs that were causing tensions between the Afghan Arabs and the Afghan Mujahideen. Funny enough, Abdullah Azzam would even enforce a sensitivity training program in 1989 aimed at training and teaching the Afghan Arabs about Afghan cultural and religious differences within his training camps, while the Mek group and Abdullah Azzam would end up issuing a ban on public criticism and discussions on the theological and religious differences and practices between the Afghan Arabs and the Afghan Mujahideen. And this became criticism that Azzam got from what I'm calling the general Salafi viewpoint. I mean, look at the two people I'm about to quote, okay? Now this quote comes from Rabi bin Hadi al-Madkhali, and I'm quoting now. Abdullah Azzam and others from the Ikhwan are prepared to live with the Rafids, the Shiites, with the Khawarij, with all the people of innovation. He is unable to remain quiet about Salafiyya, but he is able to stay quiet on Al-Raf, Shiaism, on Ahl al-Hulul, Sufis, and Wajat al-Wujud, the Sufi idea of unity of existence, about everything. And then you also have a story of Abu Muhammad al-Maqdisi interacting with Abdullah Azzam. I'm going to be taking parts of the quote and not saying the whole story. One night after the afternoon prayer, the Sheikh began talking about these controversial issues which are forbidden, and he would denounce the people who cared about Tawheed and who denounced shirk among the Afghans. And then I skipped through the story a little bit. I was on the second and third row, and I don't remember exactly where I cut him off, but I remember he was talking about taqlid and the need to avoid talking about shirk and denouncing it among the Afghans, and that we have to be patient with them, etc. I got up and said, "No, not understood." This may have been the first time anyone did this to the Sheikh, and I skipped through the quote a little bit. In this period, there was nobody as prominent and beloved among the youth as Sheikh Abdullah Azzam. I respected him for this, but I could not keep quiet on this type of matter. Inside I went quiet. and in that small window where it was quiet in this electrified atmosphere, I quickly summarized my concerns. Then there was more and more uproar. People said this is a Russian agent, and Abu al-Burhani came and took the microphone and asked everyone to leave the mosque. They never spoke to me about it or brought it up again. Now, you guys are going to understand why I use the term General Salafi. For those that don't know, Salafis have their own internal movements and viewpoints and organizations and so on and so forth. For example, Abdullah Azzam had no issue criticizing any Muslim government or Arab government or Islamic governments or whatever, and governments that followed some form of Sharia or no form of Sharia. And while people today think that this is something that all Salafi groups do today, like the Islamic State and Al-Qaeda, it isn't. If there's one thing I want people to get from this whole video series, is that I want to really nail the point that Islamist groups have their own internal divisions, ideological viewpoints, and it's not smart to paint them all as one big blob of a bearded guy with a headband and a suicide vest and an AK. There's a diversity to them. And I should state, while you do have Salafis that have no issue of being critical of Muslim governments and participating in political violence, like the Islamic State or Al-Qaeda, you also have Salafis that don't do that. You have many Salafis that tend to follow the medicalist viewpoint that view any criticism of governments that they see as a legitimate Islamic ruler as something haram. Now, these people tend to fall in line with supporting the Gulf monarchies, mostly of Saudi Arabia. But on top of that, you also have other Salafis that feel that politics is something for the politician and that Muslims should just spiritually follow the Salaf and then everything will fall into place. So when you have someone like Abdullah Azzam, who had no issue of being critical to any Muslim government and participated in politics from a Muslim Brotherhood viewpoint that began to influence many young Gulf foreign fighters who would then return home with these new political and religious viewpoints, issues began to arise. During this time, Saudi religious and political authorities would begin to notice that they had a growing radical anti-establishment, anti-Saudi monarchy, Islamist movements being formed, no surprise here, from Afghan Arabs who had fought in Afghanistan or just Arab political people that had links to Afghanistan one way or another. Now, compared to the more pro-establishment, medicalist, Salafi, pro-monarchy people, you also had your political anti-establishment, what people would call jihadist Salafis. These are people you would think of like Ayman al-Zawahiri, al-Maqdisi, groups like the Egyptian Islamic Jihad group, the Islamic State, and Al-Qaeda today. During this time, many of these jihadist Salafi, or what I would like to call them anti-establishment Salafis, would begin to move to Peshawar. The anti-establishment Egyptian Salafis in particular during this time were moving to Peshawar to flee a government crackdown following the assassination of Egyptian President Anwar Sadat by Egyptian Salafi jihadists. And this is where Azzam would face a more, I guess, in real life, to his face criticism compared to the more Gulf-based sheikhs out there. A sense of distrust began to form around Abdullah Azzam, as Abdullah Azzam had no issue working with Muslim governments if they were helping in a common cause. And for many of these anti-establishment Salafis or Salafi jihadist guys, a lot of the Muslim governments are seen in very negative and distrusting light to maybe the more overthrow and replace with an Islamic State light. And someone like Abdullah Azzam, who had no issue of working with government agencies, began to rub people the wrong way. Abdullah Azzam also comes from a Muslim Brotherhood viewpoint. And for those that don't know, Muslim Brotherhood guys and politically active Salafis do not like each other. There's some beef between them. So already there was beef there. Abdullah Azzam was now getting criticized from the anti-establishment, or what people would call jihadist Salafis. Many of these guys would begin to feel that people like Abdullah Azzam were trying to prevent any genuine Islamic discussion or any dissenting opinions. And that many of these old guard Afghan Arab guys were just an extension of the Muslim Brotherhood. Abu Muhammad al-Maqdisi would even write, "I went to Afghanistan numerous times, a month and a half at times, and sometimes 6 consecutive months." And then I'm skipping through the quote a little bit. So the call for Tawheed began to spread among the rank of the young men in Peshawar. Remember that a lot of books were circulating by all kinds of groups. Even the poems of Shukri Mustafa were printed. I went to Bayt al-Ansar, as people did, and signed up for Sada. So I arrived, and my brothers had warned me, don't expect to be able to denounce every sinful thing that you see, especially things that have to do with Tawheed, shirk, that you might see among the Afghans. If you try to denounce them, you will be stopped and may be thrown out of the camp. So I found the reports to be true. All talk about controversial issues was forbidden. Then I met a group of students, Badi al-Din al-Sindi, who was in Mecca, with whom Juhayman and others studied. They were frustrated with not being able to talk about these matters, and they suffered from the Ikhwani hostility to Salafists. Heck, the tension between the more Abdullah Azzam-minded people and the more non-Abdullah Azzam-minded people would even explode into a financial dispute. And when I use the term explode, I don't mean like killing each other explode, I mean exploding on the sense that everyone now knows there's a huge split within the Afghan Arab community right now, as that financial dispute went through a lot of people and was practically a show for everyone to watch. I should state though, for the most part, Abdullah Azzam tended to not be publicly criticized. Abdullah Azzam was still a highly respected and loved figure. Abdullah Azzam, for a lack of better words, could be seen somewhat as like the caring grandpa who looked over the younger Afghan Arabs and all their crazy, wacky endeavors. If you haven't seen the video till like right now, Abdullah Azzam was still criticized publicly. But at least from what I could see, most people did not like criticizing Azzam out front, saying his name. People would rather say his name behind his back, or say his name when no one is looking except their supporters. But for this video, I wanted to use more public out there examples. Another thing that Abdullah Azzam got criticism from was that Abdullah Azzam liked the Afghan Mujahideen leader Ahmed Shah Massoud. If you haven't watched a previous video, which you should, many Afghan Arabs had a distrust towards Ahmed Shah Massoud, and on top of that, many Afghan factions didn't like Ahmed Shah Massoud, as Ahmed Shah Massoud was seen as someone who was too liberal at times, or he was also seen as someone who made a peace deal with the Soviets and was kind of a sellout independent leader at times. But to Abdullah Azzam, that didn't matter once he met Ahmed Shah Massoud and enjoyed his company and his leadership. Within my opinion, Abdullah Azzam during this time can be seen as like the personification of the moderate faction towards the more anti-establishment factions within the Afghan Arabs. Now, Abdullah Azzam didn't just piss off non-state actors, he also pissed off many state actors, no surprise here. For example, even though the Pakistani government and Afghan Arabs had a common foe, the Soviet army in Afghanistan, they both would still view each other with levels of distrust. The pan-Islamist-driven Afghan Arabs understood that Pakistan was doing this more for geopolitics than from the bottom of their fellow Muslim heart, while Pakistan would view the Afghan Arabs as possible political foes and possible influencers over the Afghan Mujahideen. And as the number of Afghan Arabs increased and their victory and the myth around them, Pakistani authorities would begin to interrupt their activities. Pakistani authorities would even interrupt MAC activities during the war. Now this of course wasn't exclusive only to Abdullah Azzam, this was an overall theme for the Afghan Arabs. As their numbers increased, Pakistani actions against them like detentions, interrogations, and raids would increase too. Heck, for a short while, Abdullah Azzam would even go into hiding in 1986 because he felt, and in my opinion, rightfully so, feared that Pakistani authorities would try to deport him. Abdullah Azzam, like many Afghan Mujahideen fighters and Afghan Arabs, were critical of Pakistan's support for the Geneva Accords. And for those that don't know what the Geneva Accord is, to oversimplify it, it was practically like a ceasefire, peace treaty deal type of thing. And many of the Afghan Mujahideen factions felt that they were sidelined by Pakistan when Pakistan accepted this deal, but they didn't accept the deal. And just like all these factions, Abdullah Azzam would voice their criticism towards the Pakistani government. Now, Pakistani authorities weren't the only authorities that were concerned about people like Azzam, or Azzam in this case. Like I said earlier, Saudi political and religious authorities were beginning to notice Azzam's influence. The Saudis were now realizing that they were having a growing radical anti-establishment Islamist movement being formed within their own borders, with people that had links to Afghanistan one way or another. The Saudis were now viewing Azzam and his ideological viewpoints with concern, as they wouldn't want to be caught in the sights of a angered Azzam or his supporters. The Saudis would begin to fund and steer foreign fighters towards more Saudi-backed groups in Pakistan instead of the ideological different and at times possibly confronting Abdullah Azzam and Mek. I was kind of debating of whether or not I should add this to the state opposition towards Abdullah Azzam, but I'll add it just because I think the actions that Abdullah Azzam did should be noticed. So Israel is also added to this list, and before you think I'm putting on my tinfoil turban and hat and all that stuff, let me explain my points. Following the first Intifada, Abdullah Azzam would begin to write more about Palestine and the liberation of Palestine and Islamic societies in Palestine. You guys get the whole point. Abdullah Azzam would even start forming connections with future Hamas members and supporters within Palestine. And when Azzam called for Palestinians to go train in Afghanistan and Pakistan, Palestinians would go, where the goal was to then send them back to Palestine, where they would up the ante, for a lack of better words, against Israelis. Apparently, Abdullah Azzam was so energized by this that Azzam would even personally train these new Palestinian recruits. Interestingly enough, Hamas would even have to ask Abdullah Azzam to not use their name after Azzam would form the Hamas brigades in Afghanistan or Pakistan. Hamas would do this request because everything is a business no matter what you do. But also, Hamas did not want to take the political risk of going from a national religious organization that's doing armed struggle to taking on the form of an international organization doing international struggle. I should point out though that the IDF, the Israeli Defense Force, for the most part, either A, did not know about Abdullah Azzam during this time, or B, did not care about the Pakistani-based Abdullah Azzam. We can't forget that the IDF was dealing with the more on-the-ground at-home intifadas. They also had the more direct Hamas to deal with, and they also had to deal with the PLO and Hezbollah. But I think this is something that I should just point out because I do think this is antagonizing a state. Following the Soviet withdrawal in the year 1989, things became very interesting for the Afghan Arabs. Many Afghan Arabs would now return home, feeling that their portion of the war was completed. Many of the Gulf Afghan Arab fighters had the luxury of returning home, while many of the Arab Republic Afghan Arabs, or Afghan Arabs that came from like Egypt, Libya, Syria, did not have the luxury of going home unless if they wanted to go to jail or disappeared. Many of these Arab Republic Afghan Arabs would begin to go around the world in the hopes of finding a new home. Some of them would go to Europe and the United States, and others would establish themselves within Pakistan and Afghanistan, and others would go to conflict zones within the Muslim world like Bosnia, Chechnya, Philippines. But Azzam during his time would stay in Peshawar, trying to create unity among the Afghan Mujahideen factions, mostly between Ahmed Shah Massoud and Ghulam bin Hekmatyar. Abdullah Azzam and his band of supporters and security guards would now find themselves dodging assassination attempts against Abdullah Azzam. In one case, Abdullah Azzam would try to take a plane ride, but people would find out that there was a bomb on the plane, but this leaves room to whether or not the assassination was for Abdullah Azzam or someone else. But you also have a more direct, someone putting a bomb onto the minbar that Abdullah Azzam regularly spoke from during Friday Jumu'ah prayers. That one's pretty on the nose. But Abdullah Azzam and his bodyguards knew something, which was that someone wanted Abdullah Azzam dead. Even with these threats, Abdullah Azzam would still soldier on, and from what I could see, he took it pretty well. I mean, at one point an Afghan Arab supporter wanted to make Abdullah Azzam a bulletproof vest, but he declined the request. Abdullah Azzam saw himself as like a sheikh for the Muslims, and whatever happens to him is God's will. And even when peace negotiations between Ahmed Shah Massoud and Ghulam bin Hekmatyar would break down following the Farkar massacre, where Hekmatyar fighters would kill 36 Massoud-aligned field commanders, Abdullah Azzam would convince Ahmed Shah Massoud to halt a immediate retaliation. No surprise here, retaliation would of course later on happen, but credit where credit is due. This is where we see Abdullah Azzam trying to prevent more infighting. And even when the fighting began, Abdullah Azzam would still try to make peace. By November 1989, Azzam was working on an agreement between Ghulam bin Hekmatyar and Burhanuddin Rabbani. For those that don't know, Ahmed Shah Massoud worked for Rabbani, so if Massoud's leader has peace with Hekmatyar, Massoud would have to follow. And by November 23rd, Abdallah Azzam was finally able to finalize the agreement by getting some signatures he wanted to add on the peace treaty, where he would then plan to publicly declare this agreement on November 24th, aka Friday Jumu'ah prayers. On November 24th, 1989, Abdullah Azzam would drive to the Sab al-Layl Masjid with his two sons Muhammad and Ibrahim on their way to hold the Friday Jumu'ah sermons with this declaration of peace. Holding the Friday Jumu'ah sermon was something that Abdullah Azzam did normally, but Abdullah Azzam does not live a normal life, and today isn't a normal day. His car would drive over an IED, blowing up the vehicle, killing his two sons instantly and wounding Abdullah Azzam. Abdullah Azzam would then be brought to a local hospital where he died from his wounds. And the question was now, who killed Abdullah Azzam? That's a question we still don't have the answer as of the writing of this script, but we do have some theories, so I'm gonna list out the theories, explain the theories, and then I'm gonna poke holes in all the theories because I'm gonna be a centrist on this topic. And special thanks to the Caravan by Thomas Hegghammer. It was very helpful within this portion of the video. The first theory is Osama bin Laden. Osama bin Laden is a name that's tossed around, and the idea goes like this. Osama bin Laden had grown past Abdullah Azzam and wanted to take him out of the picture, so that the Al-Qaeda group could expand more. In my opinion, this theory makes no sense as Osama had already left Pakistan by this time. From what we could see, Osama loved Abdullah Azzam and viewed him with great respect. While they did disagree with each other and had basically split from each other, they were still on talking terms, and from what I could see, did not want to violently hurt each other. Osama bin Laden was even confronted with this question, to which he denied the accusations and would begin to sing off praise of Abdullah Azzam. Another name that's tossed around is Ayman al-Zawahiri. Now this theory has been pulled up and alluded to by other Afghan Arabs, and it goes along the lines of this. Azzam ideologically and kind of physically stood in the way of Egyptian Salafi jihadist influence, and Ayman al-Zawahiri and proto-Al-Qaeda would kill Abdullah Azzam to take control of the Afghan Arab scene. Now the criticism of this theory is that Afghan Arabs killing each other wasn't the norm. Another thing is that Ayman and his batch of supporters most likely didn't have the means to do this assassination, and the political fallout of a failed assassination at the time would be greater than the reward of killing Abdullah Azzam. And Ayman during his time just wasn't as influential as he is today. Well, to be honest, he's not even influential today. Another person on the chopping block is Ghudd bin Hikmatyar. Ghudd bin Hikmatyar had been known for killing and fighting other Afghan Mujahideen leaders. He was always seen as someone who was fighting to be the #1 Afghan Mujahideen leader. Azzam, on the other hand, supported any leader that he saw fit, including Saif and Hikmatyar's main foe, Ahmed Shah Massoud. But there is criticism to this theory, and this kind of sounds very innocent to say. Azzam and Hikmatyar were good friends overall, and Azzam supported a rainbow coalition of Afghan Mujahideen leaders, and Hikmatyar already knew that. Now another theory that's tossed around is that the PDPA, or the Communist Afghan government's own intelligence forces called the CAD, killed Abdullah Azzam. I feel like this one is pretty self-explanatory, but I'll still explain it. Azzam liked and fought on the side of the Afghan Mujahideen and tried his best to unite the Afghan Mujahideen. Now, the CAD had fought against the Afghan Mujahideen, and they also had a history of doing assassinations against Mujahideen figures even within Peshawar, so they would have the means to do it. The criticism of this theory is the timing. Why wait until the Soviet pullout to kill Abdullah Azzam if they could have done it any other time? Azzam, for the most part, held Friday Jumu'ah lectures at the same Masjid and was a pretty open person, open to assassination type thing. Another state actor that's pulled up is Pakistan, and it goes like this. The Pakistani intelligence services, the ISI, would see Azzam trying to unite the Afghan Mujahideen leaders as a independent anti-Pakistani action, especially when Abdullah Azzam was trying to unite Afghan Mujahideen leaders with the more independent of Pakistani influence Ahmed Shah Massoud. Another reason was that this death of Abdullah Azzam could be used to scare the Afghan Arabs into submission by killing one of the biggest Afghan Arabs. The ISI had done assassinations before, and they would be playing on home turf, while the timing following the Soviet pullout of Afghanistan does draw some sussiness around them. The criticism of this theory is that the ISI would have other non-violent means to get rid of Afghan Arabs, like arresting and deporting them, and Azzam was not a huge threat to the Pakistani state. Now these two theories tend to go hand in hand, so I'm gonna put them hand in hand. The theory goes along the lines that the Saudis or Jordanian intelligence services killed Azzam. There was growing concern over the ideology that Abdullah Azzam was preaching and the connections he was forming, so the Saudis or Jordanians killed him. But from what I can see, the Jordanians don't have a history of killing Islamist leaders within Pakistan, and it most likely didn't see them as a threat. The same could be said for the Saudis, who had bigger and more direct anti-Saudi Islamists to deal with. I'm for sure there's some people yelling at my screen for not saying this theory yet, but I'm gonna say it, and it is that the US killed Abdullah Azzam. It goes like this. Abdullah Azzam would have the means to unite the Islamist Mujahideen and was known for his anti-American views that he publicly posted in Al-Jihad and in his writings. And I mean, it's the CIA, they most likely had the means to kill him. The criticism of this theory is that the US didn't really care about Azzam. If anything, the US allowed Azzam to hold speeches, gain donations, and even organize fighters within the US to fight them godless communists. So why stop now? Now, another country added to this list is Israel, no surprise here. Azzam disliked Israel and helped organize Palestinians with the hope of sending them back to Palestine to fight Israel. The criticism of this, like I said earlier, was that the IDF did not really know about Azzam and had bigger fish to fry like Hamas, Hezbollah, and the PLO. Now, whatever theories people have, and whoever killed Abdullah Azzam was still someone who was assassinated. And within the same day, as custom with Islamic burials, Azzam was buried as soon as possible. Most Afghan Arabs and Afghan Mujahideen leaders, excluding Masjid and Hekmatyar due to them not being in Peshawar, would attend Azzam's funeral. Eulogies were given from Afghans and Arabs alike, while his blood-stained jacket was given to his family as a sign of a miracle. The tale of a martyr's smile and of a beautiful musk coming from Azzam's body and jacket would be told. The factions of the Afghan Jihad would mourn Abdullah Azzam for the coming days. For Massoud, Hekmatyar, and Saif to name a few, along with representatives from the Muslim Brotherhood and Jamaat-e-Islami, and I'm not even including international forms of mourning for Azzam. Within Afghanistan, missiles were fired into Kabul from the Mujahideen, with writers commemorating Abdullah Azzam and Tamim al-Adnani. With the death of Abdullah Azzam and Tamim al-Adnani, Mecca would kind of fall into disarray and leadership would fall into the hands of Abdullah Enes. He would run the group for a few years, doing a few speaking tours and trying to set up base in Bosnia in 1992, but nothing would materialize. Gulf funding would also begin to dry up following the First Gulf War and Islamist criticism of US troops within Saudi Arabia, and Mecca would dissolve 7 years later. Azzam's wife Samira would carry on his legacy. She would begin to fundraise for the Bosnians within the Yugoslav wars, she would help run the Al-Ansar school in Pakistan, and would even write for Islamist magazines. Abdullah Azzam was more than just a respected figure people looked at. Abdullah Azzam would help, but was not the only person who kept the Afghan Arabs in line just from his level of respect. With his death and the older Afghan Arabs leaving Peshawar, the more younger and extremist factions would begin to move in. The floodgates had opened. Following the collapse of the Najibullah government in 1992, Pakistan would begin to clamp down on the remaining Afghan Arabs, and many left. This would be the end of the Afghan Arab era. Like I said earlier, Gulf fighters for the most part had the luxury of returning home. Arab Republic Arabs, like people from Egypt or Algeria, would now find themselves kind of stuck, and a good amount of these people would begin to plot to overthrow their own governments and join hardline groups. Other fighters would go to places like Chechnya, the Philippines, and Bosnia, to name a few. Others went to live peaceful lives within Europe and America, and others went off to join Al-Qaeda. The legacy of Abdullah Azzam within many Islamist circles, especially armed, politically active Islamist circles, is that he's an imam who went to do jihad and spoke against any government that he viewed as illegitimate. His drive for jihad would cost him his life, and he'd be written into the history books as a martyr. Gaining the love and support of all types of Islamists, Abdullah Azzam would gain the love and support from people within the Muslim Brotherhood, Hamas, Syrian Islamist groups, the Pakistani Taliban, and even Al-Qaeda and the Islamic State. I mean, many armed Islamist groups would name their training camps after Abdullah Azzam, and in some cases would name their groups after Abdullah Azzam. Abdullah Azzam has a broad appeal for all types of armed Islamists, as Abdullah Azzam died before inner Islamist conflicts got as extreme and as violent as they are today. I mean, look at Syria between al-Nusra and ISIS, or Afghanistan between the Taliban and ISIS, or Boko Haram and ISIS, or To be honest, no one likes ISIS except ISIS, and even then they don't like each other, but I'm going off track. Abdullah Azzam's writings tend to be the default and somewhat generally agreed viewpoint. Abdullah Azzam, even in his death, is someone who is still being molded by people who want to use his name in his lectures. Abdullah Azzam's writing and lectures are so prominent in Islamist circles. Heck, when Abdullah Azzam died, a lot of his writings would just go to the World Wide Web, the internet, and you can still find his lectures today. Of course, Abdullah Azzam is a controversial figure though. His writings, especially The Red Cancer, has a lot of conspiracy theories and anti-Semitism within them, and I'm willing to bet that people who read his writings would end up spreading these conspiracy theories and anti-Semitic tropes. Abdullah Azzam's popularization of the foreign fighter viewpoint in his Fard Jihad fatwas and things that sort are now used by groups like Al-Qaeda and the Islamic State as their way of gaining international support and fighters, while many violent Islamists have cited Azzam or Azzam's ideas as inspiration for them. Even if it was Azzam's intentions to not support these type of groups or viewpoints, Azzam would end up giving these guys ammunition to use. Remember, Abdullah Azzam died pretty early in the armed Islamist movement, so we don't know how Abdullah Azzam would react to the 9/11 attacks or the lone wolf attacks that are targeted towards civilians. I mean, Azzam is a very controversial figure within the more pro-establishment medicalist Salafi circles and the more apolitical Salafi circles. And then, interestingly enough, the anti-establishment Salafi jihadist groups like Al-Qaeda and the Islamic State, along with people like Osama bin Laden, kind of view themselves as like the logical conclusion of Azzam's idea, and they don't see themselves going against Azzam's teachings. While people within Azzam's family, like his wife, and fighters that knew him like Abdullah Anas, would not deny his Islamist and jihadist viewpoints, but would say that Abdullah Azzam would be opposed to the more violent and extreme actions done by Al-Qaeda and the Islamic State, along with their viewpoints. Within Afghanistan, Abdullah Azzam, like many Afghan Arabs, are seen in a positive light. They're seen as people who kind of gave up their lives to fight for Afghanistan. While within many Arab/Muslim leftist circles or more liberal circles, if I'm going to be honest, most of them don't know about Abdullah Azzam, but for the ones that do know about Abdullah Azzam, there is some negativity around him. Azzam is kind of seen as like proto-Al-Qaeda who worked with bin Laden and was CIA backed. Heck, within many Western academic circles who study this type of jihadist, Islamist, people like Abdullah Azzam topics, they even have debates over how radical Abdullah Azzam is and if he is proto-Al-Qaeda. Even within Azzam's family, opinions differ over what would he have done once he was done with the Afghan jihad. Some people say he would have stayed in Pakistan and just worked to unite the Afghans. Some say he would have gone to combat zones like Bosnia, Chechnya, or even the 2003 invasion of Iraq and live his life as a foreign fighter. Some say he would have gone back home to Palestine to fight with Hamas, set up base in Jordan once again, or live his life as a Al-Qaeda commander. But that's all just alternate history, and I'm not Cody from Alternate History Hub. One thing that isn't alternate history is that Abdullah Azzam is a highly influential figure. While Abdullah Azzam is not, as we would say, historically influential like Osama bin Laden, Abdullah Azzam, 100% sure, is still a person that has helped organize a lot of the late 90s and early 2000s Islamist guys to participate in one of the cornerstones of modern Islamist actions, the Afghanistan Jihad. And for that, he is an influential figure.
ونعيد الطهر إلى القدس من بعد